Before we begin, please note that this story is a work of fiction, created solely for entertainment and audiovisual purposes. The rain that night did not fall, it punished the earth. It was a deluge that turned the world into a blurred watercolor of gray and black, drowning the ancient trees of the Blackwood estate. Inside the manor, a fortress of dark stone that had stood on the cliffside for 2 centuries, the silence was heavier than the storm outside. Arthur Blackwood sat in his leather armchair in the West Wing study, a glass of amber whiskey untouched on the table beside him. At 42, Arthur was a man who possessed everything the world coveted: fortune, land, power, and yet he possessed nothing that mattered. Since the death of his wife Eleanor 3 years ago, he had become a ghost in his own home. He stopped the clocks because the ticking reminded him of time passing without her. He draped white sheets over the furniture in the ballroom because he could no longer bear to see the empty space where they used to dance. He was a man freezing to death from the inside out, encased in a grief so profound it felt like physical armor. Outside, beyond the high iron gates that separated Arthur's sorrow from the rest of the world, a figure was moving, or rather, stumbling. Elena was 22, but tonight, with mud caking her torn dress and terror widening her eyes, she looked like a child. She had been running for 2 days. Her feet, clad in thin, ruined shoes, were bleeding. Every shadow looked like him, the man she had fled from, the man who claimed to own her debt and her life. The storm was deafening, but it wasn't as loud as the pounding of her own heart. She saw the iron gates of Blackwood Manor rising like the teeth of a monster against the lightning. She didn't know who lived there. She didn't care. It was a wall. It was an end. She reached the gates, her fingers slipping on the wet, cold metal. She tried to scream for help, but her voice was a broken rasp, swallowed instantly by the thunder. Her legs, pushed beyond human endurance, finally gave way. Elena collapsed into the mud, the cold rain pounding against her back, washing away the tears she was too exhausted to cry. The darkness took her. Arthur hadn't intended to check the gate. But the storm had unsettled his usually stoic German shepherd, Barnaby, who was pacing and whining at the front door. Annoyed, Arthur grabbed a heavy flashlight and opened the massive oak doors. The wind hit him like a physical blow. He walked down the gravel driveway, the rain soaking his expensive suit in seconds, intending to calm the dog. And then he saw it. A heap of rags at the foot of his gate. No, not rags. A person. He fell to his knees in the mud, ruining trousers that cost more than most people earned in a year. He turned the figure over. The beam of the flashlight cut through the rain and illuminated a face so pale it looked like marble. Her hair was plastered to her skull, dark and tangled. Her lips were blue. For a moment, Arthur felt a flicker of annoyance, an intruder, a complication. But then he saw her hand. It was small, scarred, and trembling violently even in unconsciousness. It was the hand of someone who had fought simply to exist. Without thinking, Arthur scooped her up. She was frighteningly light, a bird made of hollow bones. He pulled her against his chest, shielding her from the rain with his own body, and turned back toward the manor. For the first time in 3 years, Arthur Blackwood was not thinking about his dead wife. He was thinking about whether this stranger in his arms was going to die before he reached the door. Elena woke up in stages. First came the warmth. It was a deep, suffocating warmth that felt alien to her skin, which was used to the bite of cold wind. Then came the smell, lavender, beeswax, and something sharp like antiseptic. Finally, the silence. It wasn't the scary silence of the forest. It was a heavy, expensive silence. She opened her eyes and gasped, her body seizing with panic. She was in a bed that felt like a cloud, wrapped in sheets of silk so fine they felt like water. The room was cavernous, illuminated by the soft, dying light of a fire in a marble fireplace. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the world. Where am I? Did he find me? Am I in his debt prison? The door creaked open, and Elena scrambled backward, pressing her back against the mahogany headboard, pulling the duvet up to her chin as a shield. But it wasn't a monster who entered. It was a stout, elderly woman with a stern face and a starched apron, Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper. She carried a silver tray with a porcelain bowl. "Easy, child," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice gruff but not unkind. "You're safe. You're at Blackwood Manor. Mr. Arthur found you at the gates like a drowned rat." Mr. Arthur. The name meant nothing to her, but the word manor meant power. And power usually meant danger. Elena tried to speak, but her throat was raw. I have to leave," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He'll find me. The only thing finding you right now is pneumonia if you don't eat this broth," Mrs. Higgins snapped gently, setting the tray down. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. The fever nearly took you. 3 days. Elena sank back into the pillows. 3 days was a lifetime. She ate the soup with trembling hands, feeling the heat spread through her limbs. Later that evening, the door opened again. This time the air in the room changed. It became charged, heavier. A man stepped in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light. His face was a landscape of sharp angles and shadows, with eyes that were dark and unreadable. It was the man who had found her. Arthur. He stopped at the foot of the bed, keeping his distance, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked at her not with desire and not with pity, but with a strange, clinical curiosity. "Mrs. Higgins tells me the fever has broken," he said. His voice was deep, a baritone that vibrated in the floorboards. It sounded rusty, like a gate that hadn't been opened in years. Elena nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. For saving me." Arthur looked at the girl. In the soft light, she looked less like a drowned rat and more like a porcelain doll that had been glued back together. He felt a sudden sharp pang in his chest, an irritation. Her presence here was a disruption. Her breathing, her fear, her life, it was too loud in his mausoleum. "When you are well enough to walk," Arthur said coldly, "I will have the driver take you to the train station. You can go wherever you were going." "I have nowhere to go," Elena blurted out, the fear overriding her manners. Tears welled up in her large eyes. "Please. I can work. I can clean. I can cook. Just don't send me back out there yet. Please." Arthur stared at her. He saw the genuine terror in her eyes. It reminded him of a deer he had once seen caught in a trap, knowing it was going to die but pleading with the universe anyway. He tightened his jaw. He didn't want a servant. He wanted solitude. But he was not a monster. "We will discuss it when you can stand without shaking," he said abruptly. He turned on his heel and walked out, closing the door with a firm click. Alone in the hallway, Arthur leaned against the wall and exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding. Her fear was palpable. It made him feel something other than numbness. And he hated it. A week passed. Elena's strength returned slowly, like the sun trying to break through winter clouds. She began to venture out of her room, moving through the corridors of Blackwood Manor like a ghost. The house was magnificent, a testament to old wealth, but it was shrouded in sorrow. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the heavy curtains. Portraits of ancestors glared down from the walls, but there were no photos of recent happiness. It was a house holding its breath. She tried to make herself useful. She helped Mrs. Higgins in the kitchen, peeling potatoes until her fingers were stained. She dusted the grand staircase. But the one room that called to her was the set of double doors at the end of the east wing. Mrs. Higgins had warned her, "The master spends his evenings in the study. Never disturb him. And stay out of the library." He hasn't stepped foot in there since the mistress passed. But one rainy Tuesday the lure was too strong. Elena pushed the heavy doors open and gasped. It was a cathedral of books. Walls lined with mahogany shelves stretched up to a frescoed ceiling, holding thousands of leather-bound volumes. For Elena, who had learned to read by stealing moments with discarded newspapers, this was heaven. It was an escape from her fear. She walked in, entranced, her fingers trailing over the spines of Dickens, Austen, and Tolstoy. She pulled out a book of poetry, sat in a velvet armchair by the cold fireplace and began to read. She lost track of time. She didn't hear the door open. She didn't hear the heavy footsteps on the Persian rug. "I was under the impression," a deep voice rumbled, "that Mrs. Higgins gave you clear instructions about this room." Elena jumped, dropping the book. It hit the floor with a loud thud that echoed like a gunshot. Arthur stood in the doorway, his silhouette imposing against the hall light. He looked angry. No, not angry, haunted. I am so sorry, sir, Elena stammered, falling to her knees to pick up the book. I didn't mean to intrude. It's just so beautiful. I've never seen so many books. I'll leave immediately. She clutched the book to her chest, a collection of Lord Byron's poems. Arthur watched her scurry toward the door, her head bowed. He looked at the empty armchair where she had been sitting. For a split second, he remembered Eleanor sitting there, reading aloud to him while the rain fell. The memory was a knife in his gut, but seeing Elena running away felt worse. It felt like the house was dying again. Wait, Arthur commanded. Elena froze, her hand on the doorknob, trembling. She expected him to yell. She expected to be thrown out. Arthur walked over to her. He took the book from her hands gently. He looked at the cover, his thumb brushing away a speck of dust. Do you like Byron? He asked, his voice softer, struggling with the rust of disuse. I don't know him well, sir, Elena admitted, looking up at him through her lashes. But I like the way the words sound. They sound like music. Arthur looked at her. Really looked at her. Her eyes were not fearful now. They were alive with intelligence and a hunger for beauty. There was a spark of life in his dead world. You may read here, Arthur said, handing the book back to her. On one condition. You do not light the fire. The smoke, it damages the bindings. It was a lie. He didn't care about the bindings. He just wasn't ready to see the fire lit in her room yet. Thank you, Elena whispered, a genuine smile breaking across her face. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It transformed her face from tragic to radiant. Arthur nodded stiffly and turned to leave. But at the door he paused. And Elena? Yes, sir? The collection of botanical encyclopedias on the top shelf. Those are rare. Be careful with them. He walked out before she could reply, his heart beating a rhythm that was slightly faster, slightly more erratic than the slow march of grief he had grown used to. He told himself he was just being charitable. He told himself she was just a guest who would be leaving soon. But as he sat in his study that night, staring at his whiskey, he realized he was listening for the sound of pages turning in the room next door. Weeks turned into a month. The changes in the manor were subtle, like the first cracks in a frozen lake. The curtains in the east wing were now open during the day. Fresh wildflowers appeared in a vase on the hallway table, clumsily arranged by Elena, but bright against the dark wood. And Arthur. Arthur had started shaving every day. One evening, a storm raged outside again, mirroring the night they met. But inside, the dining room was warm. For the first time, Arthur had asked Mrs. Higgins to set two places at the long, polished mahogany table. Elena sat at his right hand, wearing a simple but elegant dress that Mrs. Higgins had found in the attic, an old gown of Arthur's sister, resized to fit Elena's slender frame. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with the silver fork. You look... Arthur started, his voice catching in his throat. He cleared it. You look well, Elena. Thank you, sir, she whispered, a blush rising to her cheeks. It feels strange to wear silk. I'm used to cotton and wool. They ate in a companionable silence for a while, the only sound the clinking of cutlery and the distant thunder. Then, emboldened by the wine, Elena asked the question that had been haunting her. Why is this house so sad, Arthur? She asked softly. It was the first time she had used his given name without the title. Arthur stopped eating. He put his fork down slowly. He looked at the empty chair at the other end of the table, the chair that had remained empty for 3 years. He took a long sip of wine. Because it is a tomb, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. My wife, Eleanor, she was the light of this place. She died 3 years ago. A carriage accident in the rain. I wasn't there. I was busy, making money, expanding the estate. He looked at his hands, clenching them into fists. I built this empire for her, Elena. And in the end, it was just a cage that kept me away from her when she needed me most. Elena felt her heart break for him. She reached across the vast expanse of the table and, without thinking, placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm against his cold, trembling knuckles. "You are not a tomb, Arthur," she said fiercely, her eyes shining with tears. "You are still here. And she would hate to see you punishing yourself like this. The house is sad because you won't let it breathe. But I see the life trying to get back in. I see it in the way you look at the garden. I see it in the way you saved me." Arthur looked at her hand on his. It was a shock, electric and terrifying. He hadn't been touched with tenderness in years. He slowly turned his hand over and interlaced his fingers with hers. It was a tentative, fragile connection, but it anchored him to the earth. "Perhaps," he whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. "Perhaps you are the one breathing life back into it." The moment hung in the air, thick with unspoken feelings. But just as Arthur leaned in, a sound shattered the peace. A heavy, violent pounding on the front door echoed through the hall. It wasn't the wind. It was a fist. Elena snatched her hand back, her face draining of color. The fear returned instantly, extinguishing the light in her eyes. "He found me," she gasped. "He's here." Arthur stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face transformed instantly from vulnerable to stone-cold fury. "Stay here," he commanded. "Do not come out until I say so." Elena was trembling so violently she could barely stand. She recognized the knock. It was the heavy, arrogant knock of Silas Vane, the man her stepfather had sold her to in order to clear a gambling debt. A cruel, possessive man who saw her as property. She wanted to run, to hide in the cellar, but her legs wouldn't move. She crept to the doorway of the dining room, peering into the foyer. Arthur opened the massive oak doors. Standing in the rain, flanked by two rough-looking men, was Silas. He was wet, muddy, and smiling a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good evening," Silas sneered, looking past Arthur into the warmth of the hall. "I believe you have something of mine. A little stray. Goes by the name of Elena. My fiancée." Arthur didn't blink. He stood in the doorway, blocking the view, a dark silhouette of absolute power. "There is no one here by that description," he said calmly. "And this is private property. You are trespassing." "Don't play games with me, rich boy," Silas spat, stepping forward. "I have the papers. Her stepfather signed her over. She belongs to me. Now step aside or my boys will make you step aside." Elena stifled a sob, her hand over her mouth. Arthur didn't move an inch. He looked at the two thugs, then back at Silas, with a look of such intense, aristocratic disdain that it was more cutting than a knife. "You seem to be under a misunderstanding," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you are speaking to a man who plays games. I am Arthur Blackwood. I own the land you are standing on. I own the bank that holds the mortgage on your pathetic little business. I own the judge who will sign your arrest warrant if you do not vacate my property in 10 seconds. Silas faltered. The name Blackwood meant something. It meant power beyond his comprehension. But his pride was stung. "She's mine," he yelled. "She's a thief and a whore." Arthur moved so fast it was a blur. He grabbed Silas by the collar of his coat and slammed him against the stone pillar of the porch. The two thugs stepped forward, but stopped when they saw the look in Arthur's eyes. It was the look of a man who had nothing to lose and was capable of extreme violence. "If you ever," Arthur hissed, his face inches from Silas's, "come near this house or utter her name again, I will not call the police. I will destroy you. I will burn everything you own to the ground and salt the earth so nothing grows again. Do you understand me?" He shoved Silas back into the rain. The man stumbled, looked at his hired muscle who were already backing away, and spat on the ground. "Keep her then," he muttered. "She's damaged goods anyway." Arthur watched them retreat into the darkness until the taillights of their car disappeared. He slammed the door shut and locked it. He leaned his forehead against the heavy wood, his chest heaving. The rage was still coursing through him, hot and blinding. He had never wanted to kill a man before. But for her, he would have done it. He turned around and saw Elena standing at the top of the stairs. She was holding a small bag. She was crying silently. "I'm leaving," she whispered. "I won't bring this darkness to your door anymore. You've done enough." Exactly 1 year had passed since the night of the great storm. If a stranger were to walk past the iron gates of the Blackwood estate today, they would not recognize it as the fortress of grief it once was. The massive oak doors were wide open to the sweet summer air. The heavy velvet curtains, which had once guarded the house like funeral shrouds, were pulled back, allowing sunlight to flood into corners that hadn't seen warmth in years. The ballroom, silent for so long, was alive with the sound of a string quartet playing a lively waltz. Laughter, a sound once alien to these walls, drifted out onto the terrace. Elena stood on that terrace, overlooking the garden. It was a riot of color, roses in deep reds and creams, lavender bushes humming with bees, and hydrangeas brilliantly blue against the stone walls. Arthur and Elena had planted them together, their hands deep in the soil, reclaiming the earth just as they had reclaimed each other. Elena wore a gown of pale cream silk, simple but exquisite, that caught the afternoon light. Her hair, once matted with mud and terror, was glossy and coiled elegantly at the nape of her neck. But the biggest change was in her posture. The hunch of fear was gone. She stood tall, the mistress of this domain, radiating a quiet, deep-seated peace. The shadows under her eyes had been replaced by the glow of a woman who knows, with absolute certainty, that she is safe. Strong arms slid around her waist from behind, pulling her against a solid, familiar chest. Arthur rested his chin on her shoulder, inhaling the scent of jasmine in her hair. "Happy anniversary," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her back. Elena leaned back into him, covering his hands with hers. "It feels like a different lifetime, Arthur. Sometimes I still wake up expecting to hear the rain and feel the cold." "The cold is gone," Arthur said fiercely, turning her around so he could look into her eyes. His own face, once sharp with bitterness, had softened. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a steady, protective warmth. "Silas Vane is rotting in a prison cell 3 counties over. My lawyers made sure he will never see the light of day again. You're free, Elena. Truly free." He had kept his promise. He had used his fortune like a sword to cut away the thorns of her past. Elena smiled, reaching up to touch his cheek. "I was free the moment you carried me through those doors. You saved my life, Arthur." Arthur shook his head slowly, his thumb caressing her jawline. "No, my love. You saved mine. I was drowning in that house and you pulled me to shore." He took her hand and led her away from the party, down the gravel steps and onto the wide lawn. They walked in comfortable silence toward the edge of the property. They stopped at the massive iron gates, the exact spot where she had collapsed in the mud a year ago. That night, the gates had looked like the teeth of a monster, barring her from sanctuary. Today they were wide open. They were no longer barriers designed to keep the world and its pain out. They were arms thrown wide to welcome life in. Setting sun cast a warm, golden glow over the valley below. Arthur lifted Elena's hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, his eyes shining with a love that was deeper than grief and stronger than fear. "Shall we go back in?" he asked softly. "Mrs. Higgins has baked a cake and she'll be furious if we miss the toast." Elena laughed, a clear, bright sound that rose into the summer sky. "Yes," she said, taking his arm and turning back toward the manor, which glowed warmly in the twilight. "Let's go home."